Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. This video is going to continue our series on Descartes' meditations by taking a closer look at Descartes' causal argument for God that is developed in the third meditation. So in this video, we're going to start out by talking about what I think are two incredible features about human minds. The fact that we're able to have concepts or ideas of things, and the fact that we're able to gain knowledge about the world around us. This is going to lead to reviewing the distinction between objective and formal reality, and then revisiting the empiricism-rationalism debate. Then this is going to lead to Descartes' argument or reasons for thinking that our idea of God must be innate, and how he thinks that that gives a causal argument for God's existence. When we look around the universe, there's amazing things to be seen everywhere. So just even watching a sort of waterfall can be sort of amazing. Thinking about sort of the solar system and the sun and these sort of various planets sort of orbiting around the sun at sort of millions of miles an hour, it can just be awe-inspiring. But we don't have to sort of go sort of cosmic and think about the universe as a whole to sort of find things that are amazing and sort of inspiring. Human beings, there's at least two abilities that human beings have just related to the fact that we have minds. So we're not just a mindless planet orbiting a sun, that seem particularly amazing, just a bit perplexing when we try to understand these human abilities. Human beings have the ability to form various concepts that represent other things. So I can think about the sun or think about unicorns. Jupiter, as it orbits the sun, isn't able to think about the sun or anything else. Moreover, we assume that we're able to gain knowledge about the world around us. We can gain knowledge about the sort of path that Jupiter's orbit takes. But even though Jupiter takes that path, Jupiter itself doesn't have any knowledge of what it's doing or the path that it's taking. So these are unique features of the human mind, and when we try to sort of understand them, it can be a little bit difficult. So Descartes at this point then has admitted that the human mind exists. He doesn't know if anything exists outside the mind, but he knows that his mind exists and he knows what's going on in his mind. And he knows that he has various thoughts. But it's not just that he has thoughts. His thoughts are about things. As we've said, he has concepts. So there are objects of his thought. His thought is about or directed at a tree. So when he thinks about a tree, when he sees a tree, even if the tree doesn't exist, his thought is still directed at this object of a tree in his mind. Or he can have a different thought about a different object. He can have a different thought about a unicorn, for instance. Descartes is currently in this sort of skeptical mode where he's not sure if the tree really exists. But let's just assume it does for the moment because it can help us to explain that distinction between objective and formal reality. So these objects, the tree and the unicorn, at the very least, they exist as an object of our thought. They are represented in our minds, so to speak. And insofar as they are represented in our minds, they have objective reality. So putting skepticism aside for the moment, if the tree exists outside of our mind, then it exists sort of independently of our thought about it. And so the tree, if it actually exists, has formal reality on Descartes' terminology. Thoughts are also interesting because their objects have objective reality, the tree and the unicorn, but the thought also has formal reality because the thought actually exists. So the unicorn, even though it doesn't exist, has objective reality because it's the object of a thought, but the thought about the unicorn really does exist, and so the thought as a whole has formal reality as well. But now two questions come up here. One, we can ask, where do we get our ability to have knowledge? How do we really know that that tree exists outside of our mind? Even if we don't know if that tree exists or not, we can still ask, well, where do we get our idea? Where do we get our concept of a tree? Where do we get this ability to think about the tree or anything else? So we have these two views, empiricism, rationalism. Empiricism sort of emphasizes the role of sort of experience. Rationalism emphasizes the role of reason. But now we can make a distinction between two kinds of empiricism and two kinds of rationalism. There's what we might call empiricism about knowledge, which says all of our knowledge must ultimately be justified by sense experience. Now, Descartes has thrown that into question by saying, look, if we need to rely on experience to gain knowledge of the world around us, it looks like experience is not up to the task because I could have all those same experiences in a dream. And so he says, look, my knowledge must ultimately be justified by reason and not sense experience if it's going to have an adequate foundation. And that's the project he's engaged in right now, trying to use his reason to build up his knowledge about himself and then eventually the world outside him. But there's also a distinction between concept empiricism that says ignore knowledge for the moment. Even if you don't know that the tree exists, well, you still have the ability to think about the tree. So where does that ability come from? Where does the concept of the tree come from? According to the concept empiricists, all of our concepts must ultimately come from sense experience. So you sense a tree, and then your mind sort of creates a copy of that sort of sense experience that you're then able to think about later, even when you're not having the sense experience, for instance. Rationalism is oftentimes thought to adopt concept nativism, which says at least some of our concepts or ideas are innate. They're not derived from our sensory experience. We don't need to have a sensory experience and then sort of copy them in our mind. Our mind sort of already has them. Our mind is not a blank slate. We're born with a mind that is already sort of furnished with all of these concepts. We might not have knowledge, but we have these concepts, the ability to think about these things. He says, well, it's evidenced by the light of nature. So he says he's using his reason now to try to gain knowledge. He says his reason tells him that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of that same cause. For whence, I ask, could an effect get its reality if not from its cause? Hence, it follows that something cannot come into being out of nothing, and also what is more perfect, that is, what contains in itself more reality, cannot come into being from what is less perfect. And so the claim here is that everything that exists has a cause of its existence. Something can't just pop into reality uncaused or spontaneously. There needs to be something to bring about that thing's existence. So something cannot come from nothing. So insofar as nothing just has no sort of features, it can't cause anything to happen. So Descartes goes on to say, but this is manifestly true not merely for those effects whose reality is actual or formal, but also for ideas in which only objective reality is considered. So Descartes is saying that this principle applies not just to the cause of things that actually exist, but also to the cause of things that exist as represented in our thoughts. The very nature of an idea or concept is such that of itself it needs no formal reality other than what it borrows from my thought, of which it is a mode. So he's saying when we consider our thoughts or our concepts or ideas, they actually exist. I have an idea of a table in front of me. My thought of the table actually exists in my mind, even if the table doesn't exist. So my thought has formal reality. Well, where does it get that formal reality? What causes it to actually exist? Well, in this case, I can just appeal to my mind. The existence of my thought comes from the fact that my mind thinks that thought. But that a particular idea contains this as opposed to that objective reality is sure and owing to some cause in which there's at least as much formal reality as there is objective reality contained in the idea. For if we assume that something is found in the idea that was not in its cause, then the idea gets that something from nothing. It's not just the formal reality we need to explain where it comes from in the idea, we also need to explain where the idea gets its objective reality. So Descartes here is applying the previous claim that everything that exists must have a cause to not only to the concept, but also to the content or the object of our concept. So I like to think of this in terms of information. So I have a concept, but that concept sort of contains certain information. So the fact that my mind has a thought can explain why the concept exists, but I also need to explain why that concept that does exist has the information that it does, why that information exists sort of inside the concept. So my mind is able to have thoughts, but my mind can have different thoughts. I can think about a tree. I can think about a spider. I can think about my own body. These are all ideas. They all actually exist as ideas, but each of them contains sort of different information. They represent different things. The first idea represents a tree. The second one represents a spider. The third one represents a human body. These are ideas that usually we think sort of come from the senses. Then there's also ideas that we usually think that we sort of build ourselves. So I take my idea of a horse, sort of body, and a horn, and I put those together, and I get the idea of a unicorn. So Descartes says, well, let's look at my ideas about sort of other people or of animals or of angels. Where do I get those ideas? Well, it says, well, I could just create them. I could just take the idea I have of myself. I could take the idea I have of sort of physical objects, and I could take the idea I have of God, and I could use those to create these other ideas, even if other human beings don't exist, even if animals don't exist, even if angels don't exist. I could construct those ideas by taking other ideas I have and sort of combining them in certain ways to build these. So that when he looks at his ideas, when he looks at the objects of his thought, the fact that it's a thought about a tree, or about a spider, or about a person or their mind, or about a unicorn, I can explain how I could create those ideas myself. Then he says, but there's this other idea that seems special. It's this idea of God. How is this idea special? He says, so there remains this idea of God, and I need to consider whether there's anything in this idea that could not have originated from me. He says, I understand by the name God a certain substance that is infinite, independent, supremely intelligent, and supremely powerful, and that created me along with everything else that exists, if anything else exists. There's this idea that exists in my mind, even if I don't know if it exists outside of my mind. But notice he says, the idea, what it's about, is about infinite substance. So this picture that I've drawn here in this sort of image doesn't really capture the content or information of our thought. Our idea of God is not of a cloud and sort of a guy sort of floating in a cloud with a sort of gray beard and sunshine behind him. That doesn't capture what our idea is really about. I can't create the idea of God by just taking the idea of a cloud and the sun and sort of a body and sort of put them together. That's not what my idea is. So where do I get this idea from? So after the ellipsis here, he goes, the more carefully I focus my attention, the less possible it seems this idea could have arisen from myself alone. So he says, I can't create the idea of God. He says, for although the idea of substance is in me by virtue of the fact that I am a substance, that fact is not sufficient to explain my having the idea of an infinite substance, since I am finite, unless this idea proceeded from some substance which really was infinite. So what he's trying to rule out here, someone might say, look, I also have an idea of my own mind, and maybe I could take that idea of my own mind to construct or create my idea of God myself. But Descartes says no. Look, we're able to reflect on the nature of ourselves and our own mind and use that to gain an idea of a substance. Because we're a substance, a thinking thing. So getting this idea of ourselves is what Descartes' been doing in the meditations up to this point. But he says we are a finite substance. When we inspect our own mind, we realize that we are not all powerful, we are not all knowing, we are not all good. We are finite, we are limited in various ways. And because of that, by reflecting on ourselves, by introspecting, that can only create the idea of a finite substance. And so the content, the information of our idea would be finite. And so he says there's more content, there's more information in our concept of God. The content or information of this idea sort of outstrips the information that we could get by the reflection on a finite substance. Thus, we, as a finite substance, could not serve as an adequate explanation for how we got this idea that has an infinite amount of sort of representational reality in it. So to put it in Descartes' own terminology, he says a substance with finite formal reality, so us, our own mind, cannot be the cause of an idea with infinite objective reality. So it cannot be the cause of an idea that represents an infinite amount of reality. So Descartes' argument starts by looking at his own mind and realizing I might not know if things exist outside of my mind, but I know that my mind exists, and I know the ideas that exist in my mind, and I know what they're about. And when I look, I find the idea of God, and this idea is about an actually infinite substance that contains all perfections. But he says everything that exists has a cause of its existence, so this idea of an infinite substance needs a cause to explain where the idea and its content came from. He says, but the only possible cause of an idea with this content is an actually infinite substance containing all perfections. Thus, such a being must exist. One way to try to challenge Descartes' argument here is to come up with an alternative explanation for where the idea of God might come from. Descartes says the only possible explanation for how he got that idea is that the idea was put there by God, God's self. Well, maybe we can create the idea of God on our own. Maybe we can do that by performing an operation of negation on our idea of a finite substance. All right, so let's consider an analogy to understand what I mean by an operation of negation. And he makes the analogy with dark and rest. We get the idea of light, and then we take that idea and we say, now let's imagine something with no light, with none of that. We negate it. Well, by negating light, we get to the idea, we create the idea of dark. Or we get the idea of motion, and then we take the idea that already exists, and then we sort of negate it. We say, okay, now imagine none of that. And that's how we get the idea of rest. Maybe we can do something similar to come up with the idea of God all on our own. So we could get the idea of a finite substance simply by reflecting on ourselves, introspecting on ourselves and our own nature, much like Descartes does in the first and second meditation. And then maybe I can create the idea of an infinite substance by negating that idea. So I have this idea of myself as a being that has limits. I consider the idea of myself and I see it's the idea of something that lacks knowledge and lacks power, that has these limits. And I say, okay, well, take that idea and now imagine something without those limits. Maybe that will thereby form an idea of a being without the limits and is thereby an infinite being. Descartes, though, doesn't think this works. He says, I clearly understand that there is more reality in an infinite substance than there is in a finite one. He says, thus the perception of the infinite is somehow prior to me to the perception of the finite. For how would I understand that I doubt and that I desire, that is, that I lack something and that I am not wholly perfect, unless there were some idea in me of a more perfect being, by comparison with which I might recognize my defects? So Descartes' claim here seems to be that, look, I couldn't have an idea of a finite being unless I was already sort of implicitly relying on an idea that I already had of an infinite being. Descartes' idea here is that, well, when I think about myself and the knowledge that I have, if I didn't already have an idea of a being with more perfect knowledge than myself, then I look at the knowledge I have, I might just think that that's all the knowledge there is. And I wouldn't thereby understand that that knowledge is limited in some way, that it's lacking or missing. And so the claim here is I can't just negate my idea of a finite substance, because to have the idea of a finite substance, I first implicitly need to already have the idea of a more perfect substance. Well, here's another objection, though. Maybe I could form the idea of God myself by performing an operation, instead of negation, an operation of addition on my idea of finite substance. So, as an analogy, I at least partially form the idea of a unicorn via a process of adding the idea of a horde to my idea of a horse. So I take one idea I have, take another idea I have, and sort of add to it. Well, maybe I can get the idea of a finite substance by reflecting on ourselves and our own nature. And then I observe as I go through life, I often gain knowledge that I didn't have before. And so I get the idea of more knowledge. And then I also notice that there's nothing preventing continuing this process of addition without end. So I learned something as I grew up. And then I can imagine, well, what if I were to learn more and then learn more and then learn more? Well, you could always learn more. So by thinking of continually adding without end more of these features, more of this knowledge, more power, more goodness. So I take the finite being and I say, okay, add more knowledge, add more knowledge, add more knowledge, and just do that forever. Then add more power, more power, more power. Do that forever without end. He says, by thinking about that operation, maybe that's how I get my idea of an infinite substance or God. But Descartes replies, he says, no, that's not going to work. You can't get your idea of God that way. He says, although my knowledge may always increase more and more, nevertheless, I understand that this knowledge will never by this means be actually infinite, because it will never reach a point where it is incapable of greater increase. On the contrary, I judge God to be actually infinite, so that nothing can be added to his perfection. So what he's saying here is, look, this process can give you the idea of sort of a potential infinity, something that can continue to go on forever and ever. But notice, nowhere in this process do you ever finish. You never get to an endpoint. So you never get to infinity. At any point in the process of getting more knowledge, you are never to the point where you have infinite knowledge. But he says, our idea of God is of something that already has all of the knowledge, is actually infinite. So notice here, Descartes' not only arguing that God exists. Along the way, he's also arguing that the idea of God must be innate. Why? Well, he says, because this idea can't be created directly from our senses. You don't see God, you don't feel God, you don't taste God, you don't smell God. That's very different than something like our idea of the color red. I can experience the color red, and then once I experience it, my mind can sort of copy that sort of color and thereby gain the ability to think about red even when it's not there. But I can't do that with God since I don't experience God directly in the same way via the senses. It also can't be gotten by introspecting on our own nature, since by reflecting on our own nature, that will only give us the idea of a finite substance. It won't give us the idea of an infinite substance. And then third, he says, we also can't create the idea of God by taking these other ideas we got and sort of modifying them through, say, negation or addition. And so the only other option, he thinks, is the idea must be innate, that we must be created with this idea already in us. So Descartes thinks there must be some cause external to us then that has as much formal reality as our idea of God represents. So, in other words, whatever it is that caused or created us with this idea in us must actually be infinite. So here's some questions for reflection. Do you think Descartes is right that we have an idea of an actually infinite substance? Notice, if we don't actually have this idea, his argument just falls apart. Do you agree that everything that exists must have a cause of its existence? Why or why not? If so, how do you know that that's true? Do you agree that it's impossible to construct the idea of an infinite being from our ideas of finite things, such as the idea we get from our senses or from introspecting ourselves? Do you agree with Descartes that it's impossible to sort of create this idea of an infinite being from our idea of finite things? All right, so that's all for this video. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.